Hello, everyone. My name is Allison Daigle, and I'm the co-director of the Autism Alliance. I'm joined here today with my lovely colleague, Pam McKillop and Katie Cassavant. Little wave. I would like to thank you all for joining us this evening. The Autism Alliance welcomes Dr. Miranda Milana, Pediatric Neuropsychologist from NESCA, which stands for Neuropsychology Services for Children and Adolescents. Dr. Milana will speak about how executive functioning skills play an instrumental role in one's ability to attend, to make sense of, and organize information. She will take a deeper dive into executive functioning entails and how it can impact learning strategies for mitigating these challenges for your child or student. This program is scheduled from now until 7:30. And with that being said, I hope you enjoyed the evening, and I will now turn it over to Dr. Milana.
Hey, thank you. We'll share my screen. All right. See. Oops, there we go.
Love it.
I should see. All right. So hi, everyone. Thanks for having me today. Like Allison said, I'll be discussing the topic of executive functioning, self-regulation, which is an aspect of executive functioning, what those both entail, and how those skills impact learning. I work in the Newton office at NESCA. Most of the time, I also spend some of my time in the Plainville office. I see a broad variety of kids. So I see kids anywhere as young as 2 years old, all the way up through young adulthood. So 25, 26-year-olds. I also see a variety of diagnoses and presentations. I see a lot of kids and teenagers who have autism spectrum disorders, who have ADHD, anxiety, depression. Under the umbrella of all of those diagnoses, typically some sort of executive functioning vulnerabilities. And so a good chunk of what my testing looks at and what I talk to parents about and have feedback sessions about after testing is what are these executive functioning skills and how do those impact the child's ability to function at home, at school, and the real world, and then how do we step in and help to mitigate some of these challenges that they might be experiencing. Just for a brief overview of what the agenda will look like, we'll start by talking pretty broadly about what executive functioning skills are, and then we'll look at how these skills impact learning, real world scenarios. Embedded in the executive functioning skills, we'll also be talking about the self-regulation piece, and then we can talk about some strategies for improving these skills and go through some specific examples as we walk through that. The first thing that we can talk about is what exactly is executive functioning? What does that mean? And a more formal way to define it is talking about the ability to mobilize and regulate cognitive resources in terms of helping with effective problem solving, which is a mouthful. And once you break it down, it's often compared to a CEO or a boss or an air traffic controller, because it's really based on organizing information, planning, and making decisions with that information. Executive functioning skills, as those skills take place at the very front of your brain in the prefrontal cortex. And this part of your brain controls behavior by communicating with other parts of your brain. And one interesting tidbit about executive functioning skills is that unlike some other aspects of your brain, like IQ or your cognitive functioning or your temperament, your personality, most of those things are pretty hardwired in all of us. And executive functioning is definitely more plastic. So until you reach adulthood, so your early 20s, your prefrontal cortex is still growing and developing. So those skills and that area of your brain really isn't solidified until you're 24, 25, somewhere in that time frame. So when I see a child that has weaker executive functioning skills, these are skills that we can work on and we can help improve through practice. We can help improve with training, giving kids an extra boost through different services and supports, and we'll talk about all of that today. This is a really good graphic that I like to use that outlines the various aspects that go into executive functioning, because executive functioning isn't just one thing or one job. It's pretty complicated because it encompasses a lot of different tasks that your brain is doing. So this chart's a good breakdown of some of those skills. So the first thing that we can talk about is impulse control, and that's one's ability to think before acting. So not acting on our knee-jerk responses, not doing the first thing that pops into our mind, but being able to quickly think through, is this a good decision? As we get older, we see this skill, again, just like all areas of executive functioning, this skill improves over time. And so this is why toddlers typically have less impulse control than, say, a 30-year-old. Not all the time, but most of the time, because those executive functioning skills in a toddler are a lot weaker than they are in an adult who has a more developed prefrontal cortex. So impulse control is one area of executive functioning that we'll talk about. Another area, similarly to the impulse control, is emotional control. This is your ability to keep your feelings in check. So you're not crying or yelling or whining if you're feeling frustrated or angry when you're at work or school. And so when you see a child who has vulnerable executive functioning skills, what I often see are kids who have a hard time with those self-regulation skills, both behaviorally and emotionally. And so these are kids who you're seeing those knee-jerk reactions. You're seeing hitting when they're frustrated. You're seeing whining when they might be 16 and a lot of their peers aren't whining at school. Your child might be whining because that's their initial knee-jerk response. That's their emotional response, and they don't have that filter there or those skills yet that they need to be able to take a breath, take a half a second, realize, yes, this is frustrating. However, I need to regulate myself and handle this in a little bit of a different way. Another area of executive functioning is flexible thinking. So your ability to be flexible when there's changes in your routine, when there's unexpected turbulence in your life, whether it's at home, it's at work, school, your ability to adapt and say, that's all right, let's come up with another plan, let's improvise, be a flexible thinker. The fourth aspect is working memory. And so this is your ability not just to keep things in your brain and to remember them, but being able to use them and to apply them. So it's not just your ability to know, okay, when I'm with my teachers, I shouldn't be swearing, but it's the ability to then apply that. So you might have a child who cognitively can tell you, or they can verbalize to you, I don't swear at school, or I shouldn't swear at school. I know that's a rule. Or I shouldn't be throwing temper tantrums in a supermarket. I shouldn't be running out into the street. They can tell you all of these things when they're calm and when they're regulated. However, in the moment, they're having a hard time applying those skills. And so that's a little piece of working memory too, is that it's not just remembering it, it's being able to apply it when you're worked up, when you're in an overwhelming situation. Self-monitoring is self-awareness. So how are you doing in the moment? Are your behaviors, your thoughts, your emotions, are they consistent with how you want to be portraying yourself, how you should be acting in that situation? Are they consistent with what your peers are doing? Being able to read the room and say, am I doing okay? Am I following the rules and the instructions? Am I acting a way that I should be acting? The next piece is planning and prioritizing. A lot of kids who struggle with executive functioning have particular difficulty with this piece as they enter middle school and high school, because in elementary school, your teachers are doing a lot of the planning and prioritizing for you and or your parents. So they're planning ahead. You're not getting assignments a month in advance in third grade, and your teacher's saying, okay, this is due in 1 month, turn it into me then. They're breaking it down. They might say, okay, you have this assignment on Monday, it's going to be 1 paragraph. And then the next day you might be doing the next paragraph. And then eventually you have an essay, but they're giving you that plan, that prioritization of those pieces. When you get to middle school and high school, now you're looking at a million different assignments. They're all due at different times. Some are smaller than others. Some are due in a month. Some are due tomorrow. You have to plan, you have to be able to create your own agenda, and there's not typically a teacher there anymore who has the agenda at the front of the room, writing down your daily homework assignments. You're having to use these skills on your own. There's an aspect of independence there that's increasingly difficult as you progress through school. Task initiation is another big piece of executive functioning that I see in kids struggling. And this is your ability, as it sounds, to get started on tasks. So sometimes I'll have parents say, my child can easily complete an essay, or they have so many great thoughts, or they're able to do assignments once they get started, but the act of getting started is what's challenging for them. And that's because task initiation is part of executive functioning, as is task completion. So sometimes kids have difficulty getting started, and sometimes kids have difficulties finishing, or they might have difficulty with both if they're struggling with both of those things. So it can be hard to sit down and motivate yourself to get started, and parents will say, it's a 10-minute assignment. If they just sat down and did it and stopped wasting 10 minutes complaining about it, they'd be done by now. And you have to ask yourself, why is that happening? And part of the reason is it's their brain is having a hard time motivating themselves to get started on the task. And so starting it is half the battle. At home, this might look like there's a million different Lego sets that are halfway completed. None of them ever get finished. It might look like they have homework assignments that they passed in and that they skipped a few problems, even though they knew how to do them because they forgot to go back to them. It could look like they completed the assignment and they just didn't turn it in. They forgot to complete the task, which is do it and turn it in. All examples of difficulties with task completion and executive functioning. And then the last piece of this chart looks at the organization. And we kind of talked about this with planning and prioritizing, but organization is keeping track of things, not only physically, but mentally as well. So mentally, I always like to use the example of, if you want to compare mental organization to something that you can picture, you can visualize, I compare it to a clothing closet. So if you were to think about a clothing closet that's organized, your shirts are in one spot, your pants are in another spot, things are organized, long sleeve, short sleeve, your pants, your shorts. And if I were to say to you, I want you to go in your closet and I want you to find your yellow long sleeve shirt, you'd probably be able to pretty quickly locate your yellow long sleeve shirt. However, if you were to then take all of those clothes, throw them on the floor in a pile, and I were to say to you, okay, now I want you to find that same shirt, it would take you a lot longer. You could find it because it's still there, but it would just take you a long time. And so for kids who have executive functioning vulnerabilities, this often looks like they're trying to describe something, or they're trying to convey something through writing, where the pieces are there in their brain, they're just not organized in a way that is easy to access for them. And so they might have a hard time getting it out in an organized, logical, coherent manner. And then this can also apply to physical belonging. So their room being messy, their closets, just like I described, their book bags a hot mess. And that similarly goes with those mental portrayals of that information, as things are just not organized easily for them. They don't have that built-in organizational system as of yet, and that's something we need to help them with, provide supports for. With that said, when we put it all together and we think about how all of those different aspects of executive functioning, how does that impact real world functioning? What does that look like in real time? Executive functioning is how we learn to work effectively with others. It's how we learn to work with distractions. It's how we learn to work with a million different demands going on at one time. And so knowing that executive functioning takes place in the prefrontal cortex and that it's not fully developed until adulthood, if you think about a toddler who has essentially no executive functioning skills, and then again, you think about a 30 or 40-year-old whose prefrontal cortex is fully developed and who presumably has those intact skills, toddlers can't work effectively with others. They can't stay focused on a task if you were to give them distractions. They can't handle having different demands thrown at them at once. They kind of have that one-track mind. And so when you think about executive functioning vulnerabilities and linking that to an underdeveloped prefrontal cortex of the toddler, no one's getting angry at toddlers because they can't focus with distractions. No one's yelling at them because they're not the best at sharing yet, or because they're not great doing a million things at once. And that's because we know that their brain's not at a place yet where those skills are developed, but we have to consider that same thing for kids or teenagers or adults who have executive functioning challenges. And so when you think about a 13-year-old who's throwing tantrums like a 4-year-old, or someone who's arguing with their peers like a developmental 5-year-old, it might be frustrating for parents to watch or to witness. It's also frustrating for these kids and these individuals to live these experiences. And the reason why it's similar to a younger child is because it's related to those skills that just haven't developed as well as some of their peers. And so, like I said before, it's not just being able to describe social rules and knowledge, but being able to really apply these. And the reason why I focus so much on that piece is because I often have parents that say, my child's had so many services, they know the zones of regulation, they've had so many therapists, they know a million people have talked to them about when it's appropriate to cry over something versus when we need to kind of keep it together, like at the grocery store, or when you're at school and something's really frustrating. We've talked about the size of the problem. And when they're regulated, parents will say, they can tell me all of these things. They know all of these things. However, they're not applying them. And that's exactly what's happening here and where the disconnect is. And so being able to apply the skill is just as important as knowing what the skill is. Executive functioning skills impact our ability, like I said before, some of these are overlapping. Our ability to plan, keep track of time, work well with others, waiting our turn to share ideas. So something as simple as being in a classroom where there's a group discussion, you have to know not to cut other people off. You have to know how to listen to other people respectfully, even though you might disagree. You have to know when to seek help, when it's needed, when to go to a teacher or an advisor, when to ask for homework help. There's a lot of things that you have to be able to do in order to attend to a group discussion. One of the things that I also hear a lot from parents is, like I said before, wow, my child knows how to do all of their homework, and they do it, and then they just don't turn it in. And so they're getting all these horrible grades, even though they know the material, because they don't have an organizational system in place. They forget to turn it in, or they forget they have this assignment. And like we talked about before, we have to make sure that's because executive functioning it's like describing a story in a way that's organized and the details are communicated in a way that makes sense for everyone. And then also being able to initiate activities. These are all things that we talked about before that are part of the executive function. One of the examples I want to talk about when we think about the application of executive functioning skills is when you think about what most of us would consider to be a pretty simple act, which is sharing. So most of us know what sharing is. Most of your children probably have heard, you need to share, or they have heard the concept of sharing. It's been described to them, demonstrated to them. And sometimes these kids have a really hard time with sharing. And you might be thinking, we've showed them so many times what this means, why we do it, and they really still struggle. And so when we think about it, when we break something down that's as seemingly simple as sharing, we have to understand that there's actually a lot that goes into it in order to share appropriately with others. It requires inhibition. You have to let other kids or adults or teenagers take their turn. Your impulse is, I want something, I want to keep it. And so you have to have some inhibition to say, all right, I'm not going to respond on my knee-jerk reaction. I'm going to let you take your turn. And then once it's your turn again, you have to remember the expectations for resuming play. So working memory comes into play on that part as well. You also have to be able to be flexible. If something happens that's unpredictable, like the other child isn't a great sharer or acts out, you have to be able to adjust and be flexible. When we think about this example for a middle schooler, for example, if a middle schooler lets someone use their favorite video game, they're not giving it back to you, you have to be flexible, being able to handle some of those situations and conflicts where you might say, okay, internally, I understand. I'm not going to share my games with them in the future, but right now I'm going to negotiate, or I'm going to compromise and handle the situation in a way that's appropriate. So when we talk about at surface level, what those executive functioning skills are, and the next question I usually get is, okay, so how do we help with these skills that are hard? And some of the most recommended strategies, again, depending on the student, what's most applicable for them. If organization, distractibility, staying on task initiation, those things are difficult, visual aids and schedules are extremely helpful. So being able to have a calendar up in their bedroom that outlines their assignments, going over that every night, making sure assignments are on their calendar. They can see an outline of what's due, when, and when, and then that can help them with the prioritization piece. For younger kids, breaking down nighttime routines, morning routines, being able to have those visual representations so they know what's coming next to help them plan. Another piece is working in a step-by-step fashion. Often kids get really overwhelmed when there are huge tasks at hand. So breaking things down, and instead of writing on your calendar, they have a 25-page essay, putting on the visual schedule that maybe let's do the first page of the essay on Monday, and then Tuesday's the next 2 pages, whatever it is, and then breaking things down so that it's not as overwhelming as a task of 25 pages. Or as something simpler, if something like a 25 problem math sheet is overwhelming, breaking it down. Let's do 5 problems, take a 20-minute break. Let's do another 5 problems, take a 20-minute break. So step by step, breaking things down into chunks. Another thing that's helpful, similar to the organizational tools, like visual aids and schedules, apps on phones. There's so many different apps these days that have a million different applications that can help kids to stay focused and organize their time and their assignments. There's apps that I've recommended that kids get credit or coins or whatever. They earn points in a game if they spend more time not touching their phone. And so there's a motivator there to not have your phone used as a distractor. Checklists are helpful, really fantastic. Setting alarms for activities. They also have apps that will make the visual aids and schedules for you, send reminders to a child's phone that they have X assignment due, or they have X appointment today. Those can be really helpful. Another helpful tip is keeping our workspaces organized. And for kids, this might look like different colored folders for different subjects, making sure that when they're coming home and working on an assignment, their desk isn't cluttered with English and math and spelling and history, but maybe they're putting those things in their folders until they're ready to begin that specific assignment. Another big recommendation I usually include is weekly check-ins, whether it's with an academic advisor, an executive functioning coach, a special educator, a homeroom teacher. It even could be the school adjustment counselor, but having someone at school who can help to keep them in check so it's not just their parents. Because the other piece is that parents will say, well, I've tried to tell them that they have to do their homework, or I try to tell them that these are the assignments they have due, and they don't listen to me, or they don't take my advice. And so sometimes having that outside individual that a child would hopefully connect with and has a good relationship that can step back and objectively say, okay, let's help break this assignment schedule down. Let me help you to break down your goals and how we'll accomplish each goal and get you to the end of the day or the semester or whatever it is with whatever your goal is, whether it's a certain grade or if it's completing a worksheet, whatever it is. I've recommended check-ins with academic advisors in college, and I think this is a really good time to point out that when someone struggles with executive functioning, it doesn't necessarily mean that they're never going to have these skills or they're never going to be successful. They're always going to struggle going out in public and regulating their emotions, being able to work on a group project. I've seen many, many, many students who have executive functioning challenges who go on to achieve their goals for high school or after high school. And the reason they can do so is because they've learned to implement some of these strategies and they've had help from teachers and coaches and therapists. And so again, having help implementing some of these strategies is really key in helping your kids to find success. One of the real life cases I want to talk to you about is a student that I had who was 13 and he had diagnoses of autism along with ADHD. He had some pretty poor executive functioning skills, and some of the skills that he particularly struggled with were distractibility. He struggled with impulse control, so he'd often say whatever came to his mind. Sometimes if he was upset, he would just leave the classroom. If he was unhappy, he would leave conversations with his parents. If he was uncomfortable, he had a really hard time with the self-regulation piece. He had a difficult time with organization. His bag was a mess, his papers were all over the place, his belongings were typically cluttered, and time management was also difficult. He was very, very bright. He had a very high IQ. His academic abilities were off the charts, like beyond the 99th percentile. So he was very smart, but he was getting really, really poor grades. And it wasn't because he wasn't aware of the material that was being taught, but he wasn't passing in his assignments. And he also wasn't engaging in group work. He had a really hard time being flexible with his peers and being able to understand that sometimes I need to adapt to some of their ideas in group assignments. And so then that would lead to him leaving class, leaving the group, not participating. And so then on a group assignment, he would receive poor grades because he wasn't participating. He also wasn't reviewing his own assignments, so he was making careless errors. He was completing these really crazy trigonometry problems that he knew how to do, but he would make simple calculation errors like addition and subtraction errors, and he wasn't monitoring his work. The other tough piece of this is that the parents were really struggling because he was not open to hearing about what they had to say. He didn't want to listen to their advice. He wouldn't participate in conversations with them when they were trying to suggest things that would be helpful for him. This was spilling over into home. It was making it so that the parents were frustrated, he was frustrated, everyone was frustrated with each other. There was a lot of built up tension and anger there because the parents knew you have so much more to offer than what these grades are showing. And so the other tricky piece with him is that he also was very literal in his expectations. And so you had to be very, you had to lay out very concretely what the expectations were and what the rewards were for meeting those expectations. So one thing, just make sure I'm in the right spot. So for him, some strategies that were useful was number one was involving an executive functioning coach, a therapist, and someone at his school that could all collaborate and come up with strategies that were consistent across settings so that everything was spelled out and laid out and organized in a similar manner. You'll also notice that while the parents were involved on this plan, I don't have them listed as who's going to be implementing this because there was a lot of tension there with the parents. And so what I wanted to do is push that tension off onto someone who's outside of the home, who can take a little bit more of the brunt of things, so that when there's frustration, when he's upset with consequences, it's not all on the parents to deal with, who then have to deal with dinner time, nighttime routine, and having that frustration spill over into all of those routines at home. Instead, he had the executive functioning coach and those people that I talked about. They were talking about once these things had passed, what happened, how can we develop a plan so that it doesn't happen again in the future, and how do we mitigate it now that it has happened. Another big piece is there has to be buy-in from kids. So knowing what's really motivating for kids, it might be that they want to play on the football team, or be in an arts and crafts club, or spend every Wednesday night at their next door neighbor's house playing outside. For him, it was that he really wanted to stay involved with the gaming and robotics club after school. So for some kids, it might be an extra hour of screen time at night. For some kids, it might be they get to stay up, 15 minutes later to watch a favorite YouTube video. And so we need to use what's truly motivating to get some of that buy-in. So what we worked on in utilizing his coach and his therapist is, how do we get this robotics club to motivate him so that he's completing assignments, he's turning things in, he's staying in class, and he's focused. And so the goal was, they set a goal, you have to receive these, here's the limit for your grades. And then in order for you to stay in gaming robotics club, you have to maintain these grades. And that was the plan that they came up with at that time. They also utilized checklists for him. They had schedules for his assignments and for his free time. And this piece is huge, especially as kids get older and get into settings where they have a little bit more free time, because sometimes kids will get free time for in middle school and high school, where if you're really motivated, some kids will say, okay, I have this really big assignment due, I should probably use some of my free time to work on that assignment. But kids who have poor executive functioning have a harder time planning that into their schedule and initiating those tasks. So you have to work with someone to help you to create a schedule where, okay, you have free time this week, but the next week you have a really big assignment coming up. So it looks like for that chunk of free time, you should be working on X, Y, or Z. We utilized apps on him, on his phone. So we utilized timers for transitions. This is another really big one. So especially for younger kids, when there's something that's really preferred, it can be difficult to move away from the activity. And so you'll have a meltdown of, I didn't know that I only had 10 more minutes. I need more time. I can't be finished right now. I'm right in the middle of this level. I can't quit now. It's going to ruin my whole game. My life's going to be over. And it's a whole meltdown. And so setting timers. Okay, you have 10 minutes for this game. Coming back 5 minutes later, you have 5 minutes left. Coming back, with 2 minutes left. Here's a 2-minute reminder. And so there's preparation for those transitions. Were you gonna say something, Allison?
I was going to say that I even think that sometimes something that I've used was actually practicing starting and stopping a video game, because it's a skill to learn how to start and stop. So
it absolutely is. And the other thing is that having a therapist or coach or someone else involved can also work on eventually working up to, okay, if your mom says you have a 10-minute time limit, that probably means that you shouldn't start a level that you know is going to take you 15 minutes, or you shouldn't start an activity that you know is going to take longer than that 10 minutes. Because sometimes kids will say, okay, I have 10 minutes, so I'm going to start this, and I'm going to start this. And then they think they're going to be okay with the 10 minutes is up, but they're not. And so working on, prepping for, okay, you have 10 minutes. Is this something you think you'll be okay completing in that 10 minutes? And if not, maybe we don't start it now. Maybe we start it afterwards. That can be a really tricky part.
it's a great point. Great point.
Another example I have is I worked with an 8-year-old girl who had autism as well as anxiety. Her academics were really, really tricky for her, but she didn't have, after we did testing, she didn't have any learning disabilities. And so parents and teachers were really confused as to what's going on. She's really struggling at school. She's really avoidant of a lot of academic tasks. Part of the difficulty was that she was not engaged in academics that she thought were boring or tricky. She also wasn't really participating in her ancillary services like speech or OT, and she would avoid her demands by shutting down. She would leave the classroom, she'd run out of the classroom, she would destroy property, she would rip up her worksheets. And so her grades were pretty poor because she was just refusing to do it. And when she would put in the work and the effort, and it seemed like she was putting in the effort, she was not putting in her whole effort. And so she was doing what she needed to do to get it done. And so that was resulting in poor grades. And so some of the strategies that were helpful with her is knowing that self-regulation skills were going to be key. So you could give her all of the academic material you wanted. You could give her the best speech and language therapist in the state. And if she's not regulated and she's not able to handle some of this frustration, she's not going to be able to access any of those services or lessons that are being presented to her. So again, there had to be some collaboration with her outside therapist, the school adjustment counselor, and her occupational therapist at school. They did a functional behavioral analysis and worked through identifying what are the problematic behaviors. And if your child is experiencing any sort of problematic behaviors, whether it's avoidance, whether it's, you see the typical fight, flight, or freeze. So is it that they're becoming aggressive? Is it that they're just shutting down and putting their head on their desk, refusing to work? Anytime there's behaviors happening at school that are difficult to manage, I would recommend requesting an FBI, a functional behavioral analysis, so that the school personnel, staff can really get a good sense of what's happening before the behavior starts, what's the actual behavior that we're seeing, and then what is the consequence of the behavior? What are they getting once that behavior happens? And then for her, what we did is then we developed this behavioral support plan which addressed that avoidance and those problematic behaviors that we were seeing. And so for her, she really responded well to smaller assignments. It was something as seemingly simple as they were giving her worksheets with 20 vocab words. And even though they told her you only needed to do 5, she saw 20 on her sheet and it was immediately overwhelming. And so just taking off those extra vocab words, giving her a smaller slip of paper with the 5, giving her those checklists, that was helpful. Building in breaks were huge so that she didn't feel like she needed to bolt from the classroom, but she was given that time built into her schedule to take those as she needed them. And then the other thing was that she was able to visit the counselor's office when she needed to for additional support. If she was feeling overwhelmed, not feeling like her only option was to rip up the paper, but it was to see Mrs. Smith or whoever it might be down in guidance who can help to offer her some of the strategies that they've worked on together when she was in a better, calmer state of mind. And then lastly, I can tell you all of these strategies. My screen keeps going black. Okay. Try this. Lastly, I can tell you all these strategies, but if you're in a place where executive functioning is really impacting your child's life, there's a lot of different professionals who can help. And I highly recommend enlisting the help of a third party who can take some of that brunt of some of the frustration that you might be experiencing at home. You might be experiencing with your spouse, your partner. Mental health counselors can be a really great resource. I've listed some of these before. School guidance counselors, advisors at college even. It can be executive functioning coaches. Anyone who has a special relationship with your child at school, they can be really helpful. And everyone, the team should be communicating regularly on a regular basis, so everyone's on the same page, so that the strategies being used at home are the same strategies being used at school and vice versa. Consistency is really key. I've also had kids, if they're on an IEP already at school, oftentimes an occupational therapist or someone else already on their IEP can work with some of these self-regulation strategies, can work on the executive functioning skills. And these are things that school personnel can work with as well. And again, the consultation piece is going to be huge so that you can carry these over at home. All right. Any thoughts or questions? And develop working memory. Okay, I'm seeing some of these.
Yeah, okay, great.
That's a really great question, Ellen, for when they're dysregulated. Yeah, so the piece there is going to be the memory. When you say working memory when they're dysregulated, can you give me an example?
Yeah, kind of like how you had described, like a student who, we've given them the tools and we've taught them and, said, when you're feeling frustrated, you can do this, this, and this. But when they're dysregulated, they just are really struggling to access those tools. It's like,
Yeah.
So I don't know if the tools aren't helping or if, I don't know if there's just other strategies to work to develop that skill. And personally, I have anxiety, and like I notice my working memory is like a wreck when I'm stressed out. Like I just can't formulate sentences.
Yeah. It's like, and especially as someone in the field, you're like, okay, I know the skills, but why am I having a hard time applying them? I teach these skills to other people.
Right.
So it happens all the time. And I would say part of the one piece for kids is oftentimes it's just finding strategies that work. So sometimes you might be like, this is a really simple strategy. They say they like it in the moment. And then we get to that point in time and they're just not using them. It's not accessible for them. And so I would argue for those cases, the strategies being proposed might not be the best ones for the student at that point in time. So it might need to be a little bit simpler. It might be breaking it down so that initially they're using reminders. So it's not just them expected to do it on their own, but someone's there demonstrating it for them in the moment or helping them, giving them reminders, and not just saying, okay, here are your breathing techniques, now you go and do them. It's someone sitting with them in a moment of distress and showing, how do you do those and what does that look like? And also recognizing that it's not going to be perfect, right? Even people who don't have anxiety or executive functioning challenges, none of us are perfect. Sometimes we come home and we yell at our partners or we do things that we know are inappropriate. And so focusing for kids on, it's okay to not be perfect all the time, but let's just do what we can to try these when we can. I know that's not a perfect answer. It's not like here's the exact strategy to use, but I would say just trying different strategies until you find one that's a little bit better for them.
Thank you. It's validating.
Yeah, no, it is frustrating. This happens all the time.
Thank you.
Yeah.
So Christine, I think was next, or Karen, and then Karen. My daughter does fine at school, but at home she has a lot of trouble with self-regulation.
Yeah, so I hear this a lot. And what I will say to parents is, as frustrating as this is, one of the things that this means is that home is your child's safe place, right? So using the example of your spouse, if you're at work and you've had a really horrible day, you're probably able to keep it together pretty well at work and utilize those executive functioning skills. And when you get home, you might snap at your partner, you might snap at your kids, you might start sobbing in the shower, and you lose some of those regulation skills because home's your safe place. It's where you know you're safe, you're loved. And so we can't hold it together all the time. And so often kids hold it together all day at school. They're trying so hard. They know what to do. And then they get home and it's just, they're done. They're exhausted. And so as frustrating as it is, I would say A, means you're doing a great job. They feel safe and supported at home. And B, I would suggest talking with the school a little bit about what they're doing when they were getting frustrated at school that worked at school, and seeing if you can use some of those at home. But unfortunately, typically you see worse behavior at home to some degree, just because, again, it's the safe space, and that's usually where we are our worst selves, even when we are regulated and don't have executive functioning vulnerabilities.
Her additionally, she said that her daughter no longer needs an IEP and is now in a 501 plan, and she finds it strange that would happen.
And again, that makes sense, and that she's developed that she's,